She pressed both palms flat against the foundation stone and wept. Not because she expected anything from it. The stone was the oldest section of the fortress's base wall. The specific gray-brown of granite that had been here since the original construction. Weathered and cold and present in the particular patient way of something that had been sitting in the same place for 300 years and intended to keep sitting there for 300 more. She was weeping against it because it was there and she had nowhere else to be, and 2 hours ago, Lord Cavan had stood in the fortress's senior council room and declared her architecturally useless. In front of 11 people who had witnessed 4 years of her best work. The stone was warm. She noticed this distantly warm stone in the specific way of stone that had been absorbing the sun's heat for hours. She pressed her palms harder, and the warmth intensified, and then it did something that stone did not do. It moved toward her. Not physically the specific quality of something becoming more present, more oriented. The particular sensation of being heard by something that had been waiting for exactly the quality of attention her grief had produced. And then, very quietly, in the specific language of accumulated structural memory that she would spend the next weeks learning to translate, the stone spoke. 2 hours ago, she had been declared useless. The stone had a different assessment. Which country are you listening from right now? Please drop it in the comments below. I would love to know how far this story reaches. For years of forensic architectural work produced a specific kind of knowledge. Not the theoretical knowledge of someone who had studied structures, academically the intimate knowledge of someone who had spent 4 years in direct daily contact with a single building, moving through it with the particular methodical attention of a practitioner who understood that the specific story of how something had been built was as important as the story of how it was currently functioning. She had measured walls and documented their composition. She had traced the specific patterns of modification across 3 centuries of alteration. She had identified the building phases and the particular architectural signatures of the different builders across the fortress's history and had organized this information into the most comprehensive structural record the fortress had ever had. She had loved the work. This was the specific quality of her 4 years that Lord Cavan had not accounted for in his assessment. Not merely that she was competent, she was extraordinarily competent, but that the competence was inseparable from the particular quality of genuine love for the specific building she was working with. She had not been doing a job in the fortress. She had been in relationship with it. The relationship had produced things that the council had valued, until Cavan arrived and had a specific reason to not value them. The removal session had been called on a Tuesday morning with the particular organized quality of something that had been prepared rather than reactive. The 11 council members present had the specific quality of people who had been briefed on the outcome before the session began and were present to witness rather than to decide. Cavan had presented, in the specific careful language of administrative rationalization, a 4-point assessment of why the fortress's structural practitioner function was redundant. The building's primary documentation was complete. The ongoing maintenance requirements were addressable through standard engineering review. The specialized forensic architectural approach was yielding diminishing returns, and the function's current occupant had demonstrated an approach that was unnecessarily invasive. Unnecessarily invasive. She had thought, the Western Wing documentation. She had understood, in the specific moment of receiving that characterization, exactly what it meant and exactly why it was being applied. She had said, The documentation I have produced is the most comprehensive structural record this fortress has had in its 300-year history. Cavan had said, "The comprehensiveness is precisely the concern." He had said it with the particular measured quality of someone delivering a pre-prepared line. He had said, "The fortress's structural information is a governance asset." The approach being employed has been producing material that exceeds the function's appropriate scope. She had looked at the 11 witnesses. She had seen, in the specific quality of their collective attention, the particular managed quality of people who had been told what to think about this and who were thinking it. She had looked at Aldrin, who had been at the council table's head with the specific composed quality of a king receiving an administrative recommendation he had pre-approved. He had not looked at her. She had said, "I understand." She had left the council room and had walked through the fortress's corridors, the corridors she knew better than any other living person, with the particular quality of someone navigating a space that had just been redefined as no longer theirs. She had walked to the outer yard. She had sat against the oldest wall. She had wept. The stone's first communication was not words. She had learned to understand this over the following days, that the structural memory language was not verbal communication, but the specific experiential transmission of spatial knowledge. The particular quality of a building sharing what it knew in the form of the knowing rather than in the form of language. What the foundation stone had given her in the first communication was the specific spatial experience of the fortress's full interior as the stone knew it. Not the visible architecture that the current occupants moved through, but the complete architecture, including the specific spaces that had been sealed or forgotten or deliberately concealed across 3 centuries of the building's history. She had sat against the stone for 3 hours. When she stood up, she knew where the hidden rooms were. The gift's passive level, she understood in retrospect, had always been running the particular warmth she had always felt in old stone. The specific quality of certain spaces that seemed to welcome her presence more than others. The ambient awareness of a building's emotional geography that she had attributed across 4 years to exceptional architectural intuition. She had been receiving the communion's passive signal for 4 years without the activation that would have allowed her to understand what she was receiving. The grief had been the activation mechanism. This made sense in the specific way that things made sense when they fit the gift's architecture. The communion required genuine, unguarded presence. The specific quality of someone who was not performing or strategizing, but simply there. She had been performing architectural practitioner for 4 years, performing it genuinely, performing it well, but performing it nonetheless within the governance framework that required the performance. Weeping against the foundation stone had been the specific absence of performance, the particular raw presence of someone who had nothing left to manage. The stone had been waiting for exactly that quality. She had spent the first 2 days after the initial communion learning the language, the particular translation work of converting experiential spatial transmission into navigable knowledge. The hidden rooms communicated as the specific feeling of being in them, the particular spatial qualities of their dimensions and contents transmitted through the stone's accumulated memory of the spaces. She had learned to receive these transmissions and to convert them into the practical knowledge of location and access. The first hidden room was in the North Tower's interior, a space built in the fortress's 3rd founding period. Sealed when the 4th period's modifications had altered the tower's access structure. Preserved in the stone's memory as the particular quality of a room that had been complete and functional and simply removed from access rather than destroyed. The room held documents from the third period administrative records, correspondence, the specific governance materials of a period that the archive's records showed as having substantial documentation gaps. The gaps in the archive were not losses. They were here. The passage that led to the hidden room was accessible from the Eastern Service Corridor through a specific sequence of stone manipulations that the communion had communicated with the particular precision of architectural knowledge that had been stored for 200 years, waiting for someone who could receive it. She had walked to the passage on the morning of the second day. The passage had opened for her. She had understood that she was no longer simply the expelled architectural practitioner of a fortress whose council had declared her useless. She was the specific person the fortress had chosen to communicate with, and the communication was going to continue whether the council approved or not. The forensic architectural record she had been building for 4 years was meticulous. Not just comprehensive, meticulous in the particular quality of work produced by someone who understood that the value of a structural record was entirely dependent on its accuracy, who had never rounded a measurement or softened an observation or adjusted a conclusion to produce a more politically convenient picture. The record was what it was, which was accurate, which was why it had produced the specific entry in the Western Wing section that had ended her tenure. The Western Wing's southern corridor had a specific structural anomaly. Not dramatic, the particular subtle quality of a modification that had been conducted with considerable professional care to minimize its visibility. The wall's composition at the specific location showed the particular layering signature of a sealed opening. The specific way that the stone and mortar of a filled-in doorway produced a slightly different acoustic response from the surrounding wall. The particular thermal differential that appeared in certain light conditions. The specific quality that her 4 years of forensic attention had trained her to identify with the confidence of someone who had made this identification dozens of times in other contexts. She had documented the anomaly in the standard format of her ongoing record: location, description, the specific evidence of the modification, the approximate age of the modification which her analysis placed at approximately 14 years, and the notation that the modification appeared to be unauthorized in the specific sense that it did not appear in any of the fortress's documented renovation records. She had not drawn conclusions about what was behind the modification. She had documented what she had found. Cavan had been in the fortress for 3 months when she had submitted the Western Wing section of the record. She had submitted it through the standard reporting channel, the particular administrative process by which her documentation was received and acknowledged and filed. The acknowledgement had come within 48 hours, which was standard. The removal session had been called 12 days later, which was not standard for any administrative reason she had been able to identify. 12 days was the specific timeline of someone who had received information they needed to suppress and was moving with the particular urgency of someone who understood that the window for suppression was not indefinite. She had thought about the modification throughout the days of learning the stone communion. She had thought about the specific question of what was behind the sealed opening and why it had been sealed 14 years ago, and why Cavan's family's connection to that timeline was the particular connection it was. Cavan's family had held the fortress's administrative management contract 14 years ago, the specific 3-year period during which the fortress's physical plant had been under their operational oversight. The contract had been a significant political award from the previous governance council. The particular kind of appointment that came with the specific authority to conduct operational modifications to the physical structure without individual royal approval for items below a certain threshold. The sealed opening had been below the threshold. She had not known any of this when she documented the anomaly. She had known only what the stone told her and what the stone had told her. In the specific structural language of the communion was that behind the sealed opening was a room, and the room held something that someone had wanted to not be found. And the wanting had been the motivation for a modification conducted with enough professional care to be invisible to anyone not conducting the specific forensic attention she had brought to that wall. The fortress had known about the room. The fortress had been waiting for her to ask. Aldrin's first notification arrived at the fortress's outer sector watch that afternoon, the particular administrative signal of a governance authority receiving reports of unusual activity in the building he governed and being uncertain of its source or significance. The hidden architecture was vast. She had expected secrets. The foundation stone's first communication had included the particular comprehensive spatial overview of the fortress's complete interior, the full map of what the building knew itself to contain. She had understood from the overview's scale that there was significantly more hidden architecture than she had been able to process in the first 2 days' communications. She had not fully appreciated, until she began the systematic exploration, quite how much the fortress had been holding. The North Tower's third period room was the first discovery. The second was a passage running along the fortress's eastern exterior wall, a service passage built in the original construction period as an emergency access route. Sealed during the second founding period, when a governance transition had made certain personnel movements politically sensitive and had never reopened because the specific conditions it had been built for had passed before the transition's conclusion, and the people who had built it had died in the specific mortality rate of a difficult governance period. The passage ran from the outer courtyard to the fortress's inner reception wing without crossing any of the guarded checkpoints. She had walked it on the third day and had understood, from the specific spatial experience of moving through spaces that no living person had used in 2 centuries, that the fortress had been holding her freedom of movement in reserve for exactly this kind of situation. She could enter and exit the fortress's inner spaces at will. The sealed rooms were distributed across the building's history in the specific pattern of accumulated institutional memory. Each period of the fortress's history had produced its own particular additions to the hidden architecture, and each addition reflected the specific concerns of the period that had built it: security concerns, political concerns, the particular human need to preserve things outside the visible record in times when the visible record was unreliable. The third discovery was the small council's antechamber extension, a room built adjacent to the original small council chamber in the second period, used as a private deliberation space during the governance crisis of that period, and sealed when the crisis resolved and the political dynamics shifted in ways that made the room's specific history inconvenient to maintain as an active space. The room held the specific records of the governance crisis's resolution, the particular documentation of what had actually been decided and why, which differed in specific and significant ways from the official account of the same events that she had studied in the archive. The fortress was not keeping trivial secrets. It was keeping the things that the official record had revised. She had thought, sitting in the sealed council antechamber on the 4th morning, reading the third period documents with the particular quality of someone who had spent 4 years building an accurate structural record and was now discovering that the building had been building its own historical record with the same commitment to accuracy. I need to share this. Not with Cavan's council. With the people who needed to know what the fortress knew. The first ally arrived by accident on the 5th day, a fortress porter named Davin, who had been carrying maintenance materials through the eastern corridor when Mira had emerged from the concealed passage into a section of corridor she had thought was empty. Davin had looked at her with the particular quality of someone who had worked in the fortress long enough to understand that the building sometimes showed people things the building wanted them to see, and who had been waiting for the specific person the building had chosen to show things to. He had said, "I wondered when you would find that passage." She had said, "You knew about it." He had said, "I have worked here for 18 years. He had said, "The building shows certain people certain things." He had said, "It has been trying to show you for years." He had said, "I think it needed you to stop managing yourself long enough to listen." She had looked at him. She had said, "I need allies." He had said, "Yes." He had said, "I know where to find them." The underground armory was the most significant discovery. She had known it was there from the foundation stone's initial communication, the particular spatial impression of a vast space below the fortress's eastern sector. The specific quality of a room designed for significant storage that the communion had transmitted with a particular emphasis she had come to recognize as the building's way of indicating priority. She had saved it for when she had allies, which she now had. Davin and 4 other long-service fortress staff members who had each, in their own years of building proximity, developed the ambient form of stone sensitivity that stopped short of the gift's full communion, but produced the particular relationship with the building that made them the specific people the fortress had been trying to reach. None of them had the gift. All of them had the building's trust. The underground armory had been built 4 generations ago by the governance council of a period that had been facing a specific military threat that had subsequently not materialized. The council had understood correctly that military resources needed to be held in reserve in a location whose existence the specific intelligence threat of that period could not identify, which had led to the building of a storage system below the fortress's visible architecture that was accessible only through the specific structural knowledge that the communion could provide. The armory's contents, weapons, armor, the specific military equipment of a force prepared for a siege that had not come. The materials were 4 generations old, and some of them required assessment for current utility. But the majority the specific weapons and armor that had been stored with the particular preservation care of a period that had understood that storage duration was uncertain were in the specific condition of things that had been kept well. The communion had also communicated something about the armory that was not its material contents. The armory's records were still here. The specific administrative documentation of the armory's creation, the governance council's authorization, the construction records, the inventory logs was stored in the armory itself, in the sealed administrative cabinet that occupied the armory's northwest corner. These records documented the armory's existence and the governance authority's knowledge of it, which meant that the armory was not an unauthorized secret structure. It was a legitimately authorized resource that had simply been lost to institutional memory across 4 generations of governance transitions. She had spent the 6th and 7th days with Davin and the other allies assessing the armory's contents and copying the administrative records. On the 8th day, Aldrin had noticed, not the armory, specifically the particular pattern of unusual activity that the fortress's internal movement records were beginning to accumulate. The specific quality of a governance authority, receiving reports of unexplained movement in the building's lower sectors and of staff members who were spending unusual amounts of time in areas that their functions did not require them to be. She had known he had noticed before the report reached him. The communion had communicated the specific quality of the building's awareness of his attention shifting toward the east sector. The particular change in the fortress's ambient monitoring state that preceded an authority figure beginning an active inquiry. She had thought, good. She had thought, he is going to come to the east sector and find something. She had thought, I need to decide what I want him to find. The Western Wing's sealed room had been communicating since the third day. She had been prioritizing other discoveries, the North Tower, the passages, the armory, because those discoveries had immediate operational value, and the Western Wing's sealed room required a specific kind of preparation. Not the physical preparation of accessing the space, which the communion had made straightforward. The particular internal preparation of knowing that what was behind the sealed modification was the specific thing that had gotten her removed, which meant engaging with it required the particular quality of attention that the gift worked best with. Genuine presence rather than strategic positioning. She had sat in the Eastern Passage on the 8th evening and had asked the fortress directly. The communion's response had been the particular spatial experience of the Western Wing room, as the building knew it, the specific dimensions, the specific contents, and the particular emotional quality that the building associated with the space. The building knew the room the way it knew all its spaces, as the accumulated record of everything that had occurred within it, the specific memory of everyone who had been in it and what they had done there. The room held the documentation of a financial transaction. Specifically, the particular governance documentation of a territorial resource allocation that had been conducted during the Cavan family's administrative management contract 14 years ago, in which a significant natural resource asset in the fortress's eastern territorial holdings had been transferred to a private commercial interest through the specific administrative mechanism that the management contract authorized, at a price that the documentation's internal comparison records showed as substantially below the asset's assessed market value. The documentation also held the specific record of where the difference between market value and transfer price had gone. To the Cavan Family Trust, she had received this from the communion with the particular quality of someone who had been half expecting it and had still been affected by the scale of it. This was not a minor governance irregularity. The asset transferred the specific eastern or deposit that the fortress's territorial holdings included was a significant governance resource whose below-market transfer had cost the Crown a substantial sum across 14 years of the commercial interests' exploitation of the asset. Cavan had sealed this room to protect documentation that proved his family had conducted a governance transaction that constituted corruption. He had removed her to prevent her from accessing the wall that separated the current corridor from the sealed room, because her forensic attention had already identified the modification and noted it in the official record. And the official record's notation was the specific thing that would lead any competent investigator to look more closely at what was behind it. She had thought about Aldrin, about the king who had authorized her removal without examining Cavan's motivation, who had been governing with the particular trust that his most recent senior advisor was serving his interests rather than his own family's. She had thought, he does not know. She had thought, The question is whether what he does not know will matter to him once he does. She had asked the fortress where Aldrin was likely to search first, given the reports his monitoring had been receiving. The fortress had communicated the specific location of his most probable approach, the eastern sector's main service corridor, which was the particular administrative route that the monitoring reports would have indicated as the area of unusual activity. She had gone to the eastern sector's main service corridor and had waited. She had not staged the encounter. She had simply been present in the specific, honest way the gift required, and she had let the fortress do what the fortress would do when the right person arrived in the right space. He came through the eastern service corridor at the 10th hour of the morning with 2 guards and the particular quality of a governance authority conducting a personal investigation rather than delegating it, the specific directness of someone who had decided that the unusual activity reports warranted his own presence rather than an intermediary's. He had been told the eastern sector. He had not been told the specific room. The entrance to the concealed passage was at the corridor's midpoint, the particular stone manipulation that the communion had communicated, the specific sequence that the fortress had been waiting for the right person to know. She was standing inside the passage's entrance when she heard him approach. Welcome back to the Alpha King Rain channel. Today I'm bringing you a brand new and incredibly captivating story that will surely enthrall you if you listen to the whole video. The story is entirely fictional. The video is created using AI, and it's designed to provide value, entertainment, and positive education for viewers aged 13 and up. Now, let's dive into today's story. And she had made a specific decision about the encounter. She would not hide, and she would not stage it. And she would simply be there when he arrived at the particular place where the passage entrance was. He found the entrance. Not because she had told him where it was, because the fortress had communicated it to him in the specific ambient way it communicated to people who were paying genuine attention. He had stopped at the exact point in the corridor where the wall's quality was different. The particular warmth of stone that concealed a passage versus stone that did not. And his hand had gone to the wall in the specific reaching gesture of someone who was responding to something they had felt rather than seen. The passage had opened. He had looked at Mira standing inside it and said nothing for a long moment. She said, "This passage was built in the original construction period." She said, "It was sealed in the second founding period for specific political reasons." She said, "It runs from here to the inner reception wing without crossing any of the guarded checkpoints." He said, "How long have you known about it?" She said, 8 days. He said, "How did you find it?" She said, "The fortress communicated it to me." He said nothing for a moment. He said, "The fortress." She said, "Yes." He looked at the passage, at the specific quality of a space that was clearly real and clearly old and clearly had no business existing in the section of wall where it existed. In a building whose complete architectural documentation was supposed to be the record she had spent 4 years producing. He said, "My documentation, your documentation did not include this." She said, "No." She said, "The passage is one of several spaces the fortress has communicated to me since I was removed from the practitioner function." She said, "The documentation I produced in 4 years was the documentation of the visible architecture." She said, "The fortress also has a hidden architecture." She said, "I am now documenting that." He said, "On whose authorization?" She said, "The fortress's." He looked at her. She said, "You may come in if you would like to see it." He came in. The North Tower's third period room was the best first demonstration. She had thought about which discovery would communicate the gift's nature most effectively, which space would allow Aldrin to receive what she was going to tell him with the specific quality of genuine rather than managed reception. The armory was the most significant discovery in governance terms, but its scale and implication required more foundation than a first encounter could support. The sealed council antechamber was historically significant, but emotionally complex. The North Tower room was the particular right scale, significant enough to demonstrate the gift's reality, contained enough to receive without being overwhelmed. She walked him to the North Tower. She walked him through the passage, through the specific route that the communion had made as familiar to her as the building's visible corridors, to the particular location where the third period room's entrance was accessible. She placed her palm on the wall. The stone communicated the room's location and the entrance sequence with the particular immediate warmth of a building that was very pleased to be sharing something it had been holding for 200 years. The entrance opened. He stood in the doorway of a room that had not appeared in any architectural record of his family's ancestral home, looking at third period documents in original condition that the archive's records showed as lost. She said, "The fortress's hidden architecture was built across multiple periods for multiple reasons." She said, "The stone communion is the specific gift that allows me to receive the building's accumulated knowledge of these spaces." She said, "The gift requires physical contact with the stone and genuine presence. It does not work through strategy or performance." He said, "The gift activated when you were weeping against the foundation stone." She said, "Yes." He said, "After the removal." She said, "Yes." He said, "The grief produced the specific quality the gift required." She said, "Yes." She said, "The stone had been trying to communicate with me for 4 years." She said, "I was always managing my presentation within the governance framework." She said, "The gift required me to stop managing." He looked at the third period documents on the room's shelving. He said, "What else has it communicated?" She said, "The complete hidden architecture of the fortress." She said, 17 discrete spaces across the building's 300-year history. She said, "The passages connecting them." She said, "The contents of each space." She said, "And the western wing's sealed room." He was very still. She said, "The modification you were told was unnecessarily invasive documentation." He said, "Yes." She said, "The building knows what is behind the modification." He said, "Tell me." She told him. The first day's encounter produced the particular restructuring that genuine new information always produced when it arrived in full rather than in managed portions, the specific quality of someone encountering the complete picture of a thing they had been receiving partial pictures of and having the partial pictures suddenly resolve into a very different shape than they had been forming. He came back the following morning, not with the governance apparatus alone, the specific quality of someone who had decided that the investigation required his personal presence rather than official process. He came to the North Tower's hidden room and sat at the room's small table with the third period documents still on the shelves, and the particular quality of someone who had been thinking overnight about the specific implications of the Western Wing documentation and had arrived at a specific morning question. He said, "The transaction's timeline." She said, "The documents in the Western Wing room cover the 14-year period since the transaction's execution." She said, "They include the specific governance records of the allocation decision, the transfer documentation, and the financial records that trace the price differential." He said, "To Cavan's family trust." She said, "Yes." He said, "The amount." She said, "The assessment records in the Western Wing documents show the ore deposit's market value across the 14 years of the commercial interests exploitation." She said, "The differential between the transfer price and the cumulative market value represents a significant sum." He said nothing for a long time. He said, "Cavan's first action as senior advisor was to remove you." She said, "Yes." He said, "Before he could have known what your 4-year record contained." She said, "He received the Western Wing section of the documentation 12 days before the removal session was called." She said, "The Western Wing section included the anomaly notation for the sealed modification." She said, "The modification is the sealed room's entrance." He said, "He moved immediately." She said, "Yes." He said, "And I authorized the removal without examining his stated rationale for it." She said, "Yes." She said, "The rationale was that my work was unnecessarily invasive." She said, "The specific work the rationale applied that characterization to was the documentation that had identified the modification." He was quiet. She said, "I am not telling you this to extend the accounting." She said, "I am telling you because the full picture requires the accurate timeline." He said, "I know." He said, "What else is in the fortress's hidden architecture that I should know about?" She told him about the armory. She told him about the service passages. She told him about the council antechamber and the third period governance crisis records. She told him the full systematic account with the particular organized clarity of someone who had been building this picture for 10 days and had prepared to share it with him from the beginning. He listened. He asked the specific questions of someone who was receiving significant new information and wanted to make sure the picture was complete rather than managing it into something more comfortable. On the 6th day of the daily meetings, Cavan's formal challenge arrived. The formal challenge was 8 pages and had the specific structural architecture of a document, produced by someone who understood that the initiative they were challenging had already acquired more institutional momentum than the original removal order had been designed to prevent. She read it and identified its load-bearing arguments within the first 3 pages. The first argument addressed the unauthorized access, that the use of concealed architectural spaces within the fortress without governance authorization constituted a security violation of the specific type that fell under the military governance provisions, which had the particular administrative implication of being resolvable through the fortress's military command rather than through the civil governance process. The second argument addressed the gift specifically, that the specific capacity she had claimed structural communication with the building was not a recognized governance function, and therefore any intelligence purportedly derived from the capacity was not admissible in formal governance proceedings without the particular independent verification process that unrecognized capacities required. The third argument, the one she had been expecting, addressed the Western Wing documentation directly, that the forensic architectural documentation she had produced during her official function was subject to the governance confidentiality provisions that covered official records produced within the course of a governance function, and that sharing, discussing, or acting on that documentation after the function's termination constituted a specific breach of the confidentiality provision. The confidentiality argument was designed to make her documentation inadmissible and to give Cavan's faction the specific procedural basis for preventing the Western Wing evidence from reaching any formal governance proceeding. She brought the challenge to Aldrin in the North Tower's hidden room. He read it. He said, "The confidentiality argument." She said, "Yes." She said, "It is designed to foreclose the Western Wing evidence before the formal proceeding." He said, "The argument is technically constructed to apply to records produced in the course of a governance function." He said, "Your 4-year documentation record was produced in exactly that context." She said, "Yes." She said, "The counter-argument is that the specific record, the confidentiality provision, is being applied to documents a governance fraud that the provision was not designed to protect." She said, "Applying the confidentiality provision to protect the evidence of the transaction the documentation reveals is the specific misuse of a procedural protection." He said, "The argument is legally sound in principle." He said, "It requires the formal counsel to determine whether the provision's application in this context serves the provision's intent." She said, "Yes." She said, "Which means the formal council session is the appropriate resolution venue." He said, "Cavan controls 6 of the council's 11 votes." She said, "Yes." He said, "The 6 include the votes that were in the removal session." She said, "Yes." He said, "The formal council is not a guaranteed resolution." She said, "No." She said, "The resolution depends on what is presented in the session and how it is presented." He said, "What can the fortress's hidden architecture contribute to the session?" She said, "The third period documents in the North Tower room contain records of previous governance fraud proceedings in the fortress's history." She said, "The proceedings include the specific precedent that the confidentiality provision does not apply to documentation of fraud regardless of the documentation's origin." He said, "A 300-year-old precedent." She said, "Yes." She said, "The fortress has been holding precedents as well as secrets." He looked at her. He said, "The formal council session is in 4 days." She said, "Yes." She said, "I need 3 of them to prepare the presentation." He said, "You have them." He said, "And the armory's administrative documentation." She said, "Yes." She said, "The armory's records establish the legitimate governance authority for the hidden architecture's existence." She said, "They are the particular counter to the unauthorized access argument." He said, "Good." He said, "The challenge's second argument." He said, "The unrecognized capacity claim." She said, "Yes." She said, "The building will provide the demonstration." She said, "The challenge cannot survive a demonstration conducted in the council chamber itself." He looked at her with the particular quality she had been building her evidence base about. He said, "You're going to demonstrate the communion in the formal council session." She said, "Yes." She said, "The fortress has been waiting for exactly that opportunity." The evening before the formal council session had the particular quality of something that had been building toward an arrival and was now in the final hours before it. She sat in the Eastern Passage's widest section, the particular space that the communion had communicated as the point of strongest connection in the building's hidden architecture. The specific location where the accumulated memory of the fortress's full history was most densely concentrated and most accessible to the gift's reception, and she let the communion run at its full depth. The fortress knew the session was coming. The specific quality of an ancient building that had been holding its secrets for generations and was finally in proximity to the particular resolution it had been structured toward was difficult to describe in the particular experiential language of the communion, the closest she had come to. Articulating it was the specific quality of something that had been waiting patiently for a very long time and could feel the patience approaching its end. She had thought about the option of not attending the session. The formal council was Cavan's territory, 6 of 11 votes. The particular procedural control of someone who had managed this building's governance to his family's benefit for 14 years and understood the specific procedural levers that controlled outcomes in this space. The session's risk was real. The option had dissolved against the particular clarity the communion produced. She was the person the fortress had chosen to communicate with. What the fortress had given her was not hers alone, it was the building's accumulated evidence of its own history. The specific institutional memory of 3 centuries of the fortress's existence, preserved in the stone and held for the particular person who could receive it and who could carry it into the spaces where it could matter. She was not going to not attend the session. Aldrin came into the passage at the 9th hour. He came with the particular quality she had come to recognize as his genuine mode. Direct, the governance performance absent. The specific quality of someone who was present rather than positioned. He said, "The presentation is ready." She said, "Yes." He said, "The North Tower documents are in the formal council's record of evidence." She said, "Yes." He said, "The Armory's administrative documentation is filed." She said, "Yes." He said, "Mira." She said, "Yes." He said, "I want to say something before the session changes the context." She said, "Say it." He said, "I authorized your removal on the basis of a recommendation I did not examine with the specific care it required." He said, "I had a senior advisor whose first significant action was directed at the most experienced structural practitioner my fortress had employed, and I did not ask why." He said, "The reason I did not ask is the specific governance failure that produced 12 days of you living in the building's hidden architecture while the council thought you had left the premises." She said, "Yes." He said, "I am telling you this before the session because it is accurate, and because accuracy is what this situation requires rather than what is convenient." She said, "Yes." She said, "I received it." He said, "The communion." She said, "Yes." He said, "What is the fortress saying tonight?" She said, "It is." She paused with the particular careful quality of someone translating structural memory into spoken language. She said, "It is the quality of something that has been holding evidence for a very long time and is ready to give it to the people it was held for." He said, "For the governance structure it was built to serve." She said, "Yes." He said, "Tomorrow." She said, "Yes." She placed her palm flat against the passage wall and felt the fortress's accumulated patience communicating through the stone with the particular warmth of something that was, at long last, at the end of its waiting. The formal council session had 12 members, the 11 from the original removal session, plus the fortress's senior military commander, whose presence Aldrin had specifically requested on the basis that the military governance provisions invoked in Cavan's challenge required the military command's representation. She stood at the witness position in the same room where she had been declared architecturally useless. She said, The formal challenge argues that my access to the fortress's concealed architecture was unauthorized. She said, "I will address this first." She put the armory's administrative documentation on the witness table. She said, "The fortress's hidden architecture was constructed across multiple periods under specific governance authority." She said, "The armory's administrative records, located in the armory itself and copied by me through the Stone Communion 8 days ago, document the Governance Council's authorization for the hidden architecture's creation." She said, "The armory, the passages, and the connected spaces were built as legitimate governance resources and have been held in the building's structure across 4 generations of governance transitions." She said, "Accessing them is not unauthorized." She then said, "The challenge argues that the Stone Communion is an unrecognized capacity whose products cannot serve as evidence." She said, "I will address this by demonstrating it." She placed both palms on the council chamber's interior wall. The fortress communicated immediately the particular enthusiastic warmth of a building that had been waiting for exactly this demonstration in exactly this room for a specific long time. She said, "The stone is communicating the specific history of this room across the 300-year period of the fortress's existence." She said, "The room has been used for 19 distinct governance proceedings in its history." She said, 17 of those proceedings involved decisions whose formal record I have reviewed in the visible archive. She said, 2 of them did not appear in the visible archive. She said, "The records of those 2 proceedings are in the sealed council antechamber, accessible through the passage 2 rooms east of this one." She said, "The council may verify this in the course of the formal proceedings." She said, "The records are in original condition." She said, "The challenge's third argument invokes the confidentiality provision to foreclose the Western Wing documentation." She put the North Tower's third period documents on the witness table. She said, "These documents, held in the fortress's hidden architecture since the third founding period, contain the specific precedent that the confidentiality provision does not apply to documentation of governance fraud regardless of the documentation's origin." She said, "The Western Wing documentation describes a governance transaction conducted by Lord Cavan's family during their administrative management contract 14 years ago, in which a territorial resource asset was transferred to a private commercial interest at a price substantially below market value, with the differential flowing to the Cavan Family Trust." She said, "The evidence for this transaction is in the sealed room behind the Western Wing modification I documented in my official record." She said, "The council may access that room through the communion if it chooses to do so." She said, "The fortress has been holding this evidence for 14 years." She said, "It communicated it to me when I had sufficient access to receive it." She looked at Aldrin. He said, "The king will respond." Aldrin stood at the governance position. He said, 14 days ago, I authorized the removal of the fortress's structural practitioner on the recommendation of my senior advisor." He said, "The recommendation characterized her work as unnecessarily invasive." He said, "I did not examine the specific evidence for this characterization." He said, "I did not ask why my most recently appointed senior advisor's first significant governance action was the removal of the practitioner who had produced the most comprehensive structural record in the fortress's documented history." He said, "The reason for the removal was that the practitioner's forensic documentation had identified a structural modification in the Western Wing whose investigation would have led directly to the sealed room that Lord Cavan's family had created during their administrative management contract to preserve the evidence of a governance transaction they had conducted without the Crown's full knowledge and at the Crown's financial expense. He said, Lord Cavan's family transferred a territorial or deposit asset to a private commercial interest at substantially below market value, with the price differential flowing to the family trust, under the cover of the Administrative Management Contracts Modification Authority. He said, the practitioner's documentation did not know this. She documented a structural anomaly. The anomaly was correctly documented. The anomaly's investigation would have led to this information. The removal was the specific action of someone who understood what the anomaly's investigation would produce and needed to prevent it before it could produce it. He said, the fortress has held the evidence of this transaction in the sealed room for 14 years. He said, the evidence was accessible to the Stone Communion practitioner who had been removed before she could find it, and who then found it anyway by living in the building's hidden architecture for 12 days after the removal. He said, Lord Cavan's challenge to the formal proceedings is denied on all three grounds. He said, the governance investigation into the territorial or deposit transaction will commence immediately. He said, Lord Cavan will be placed in formal administrative detention pending the investigation's completion. He said, Mira will present her formal requirements to the council. Cavan said, the confidentiality provision, Aldrin said, has been addressed by the 300-year precedent she placed in evidence. He said, the provision does not apply to fraud documentation. He said, the challenge has no remaining basis. She stepped forward. She presented three requirements. The Living Architecture institute a formal governance body with the specific mandate of recognizing, training, and supporting practitioners of Stone Communion and structural memory gifts, with the particular institutional design that acknowledged these gifts as the specific form of architectural intelligence they were. The accumulated knowledge of ancient structures made accessible through the particular biological capacity of practitioners who could receive it. The Institute would maintain the formal record of the fortress's hidden architecture, all 17 spaces now documented and mapped through the Communion's communication, and would conduct the particular ongoing relationship with the building that allowed its accumulated knowledge to continue, being accessible to the governance structure it had been built to serve. She said, the fortress has been holding knowledge for 300 years that the governance structure that owns the building has not been able to access because the specific capacity required to receive it was not recognized as a governance function. She said, the Institute exists to ensure this specific institutional failure does not persist. The concealed architecture audited a formal survey of all hidden and sealed spaces in the fortress now documented through the Communion, to be conducted under the Institute's authority, producing the comprehensive official record of the building's complete architecture for the first time in its history. The audit would include the specific assessment of each space's governance relevance, the particular determination of which hidden spaces held resources, precedents, or evidence relevant to current governance functions, and the formal integration of that assessment into the fortress's ongoing administrative record. She said, the fortress's hidden architecture is not an anomaly to be managed. She said, it is the specific accumulated institutional memory of 3 centuries of governance in this building. She said, the audit exists to ensure that memory is in the official record rather than in the stone alone. The documentation independence provision, a formal governance requirement that official structural documentation records produced by certified practitioners could not be administratively suppressed, reclassified, or used as the basis for the practitioner's removal without the specific independent review of the documentation's content by a panel of unaffiliated practitioners. The provision addressed the exact mechanism that had been used against her: the administrative removal of the practitioner as the specific method for suppressing inconvenient documentation. She said, "I was removed to prevent documentation that had already been produced from being investigated." She said, "The provision ensures that removing the practitioner cannot function as a mechanism for suppressing the practitioner's work." She said, "These three requirements address the governance failures that produced 14 days of fortress communication being received by someone living in the building's hidden architecture while the council thought she had left." She said, "They are not conditions for my personal decisions." She said, "The personal decisions are mine." The council voted. Cavan 6 had become 4 when 2 of his faction's members had received the or deposit transactions evidence and made the specific individual calculation that the faction's interests were no longer worth the loyalty their votes had represented. The remaining 9 voted for all 3 requirements. The Living Architecture Institute held its first formal session 26 days after the council vote. She had spent those 26 days completing the concealed architecture audit, the systematic documentation of all 17 hidden spaces in a form that the fortress's official record could contain, with the particular care of someone who understood that the audit's value was entirely dependent on its accuracy, and that accuracy required the specific combination of communion-derived spatial knowledge and formal documentation methodology that her 4 years of practitioner work had given her. The audit's findings were significant in every dimension. The 17 spaces contained resources, records, and evidence relevant to the fortress's current governance in ways that had not been accessible before the communion. The third period documents from the North Tower had required a full week of careful review to assess their governance relevance. They contained specific records of previous succession crises and their resolutions that the current governance structure's archive had been missing, producing the particular informed picture of the fortress's actual constitutional history that the official archive could only hint at. The Armory's assessment had determined that approximately 60% of its contents were in serviceable condition after proper maintenance. The remaining 40% required either restoration or disposal. The Armory's resources represented a significant governance asset that had been sitting below the fortress for 4 generations, accumulating value through the particular patient waiting of things that had been prepared for a crisis that had not come and were available for the next one. The audit had also found 3 spaces the communion had not communicated in the initial overview the specific quality of a building that had been sharing its secrets progressively rather than all at once, communicating what the immediate situation required and holding in reserve the material that would be relevant later. 2 were minor storage spaces from the 4th founding period, whose contents were archival rather than governance critical. The 3rd was a judicial record room from the 2nd period, holding the specific documentation of proceedings that had been conducted in the fortress's early governance history, and that the official archive showed as lost in a fire that the communion communicated had not actually destroyed the records. They had been moved to the hidden room before the fire and had not been returned because the political climate following the fire had made the records' continued inaccessibility convenient. The institute had 7 founding practitioners, Davin, and the 4 other long-service staff members whose ambient stone sensitivity made them the appropriate initial cohort, plus 2 practitioners she had identified through the institute's founding identification protocol, who carried the full communion gift at different levels of development. She had sat with each one in the communion spaces and had said, "The building will show you what you are ready to receive." She had said, "The gift requires genuine presence rather than managed performance." She had said, "The more you allow yourself to simply be here, the more it will communicate." Aldrin had come to the Institute's founding sessions every day. She had been building the evidence base with the particular patient precision of someone who understood that the most important assessments required time, and that time well spent was not the same as time delayed. He had read the full audit report himself. He had asked questions that demonstrated he had read it. He had attended the 3rd period document review sessions and had engaged with the specific historical governance questions the documents raised. He had spent an afternoon in the North Tower hidden room, not for any governance purpose, but because the room had the particular quality of the building's accumulated memory at its most concentrated. And he had wanted to be in that quality and understand what she spent her days receiving. He had come out of the North Tower room with the specific quality of someone who had been somewhere that exceeded their previous experiential framework. He had said, "I felt something." He had said, "It was not the full communion." He had said, "It was the particular ambient quality of a space that has held a great deal." She had said, "Yes." She had said, "That is the gift's passive level." She had said, "You have some degree of stone sensitivity." He had looked at her. He had said, "Not enough to receive what you receive." She had said, "No." She had said, "Enough to understand why I receive it." He had said, "Yes." He had come back the following morning. The foundation stone was at the fortress's oldest corner, the specific section of original construction that the communion had communicated as the building's primary consciousness point. The particular location where the accumulated 3 centuries of structural memory were most densely concentrated and most actively present. She came here every morning before the Institute's sessions began. Not always for formal communion, sometimes simply to be in the presence of the oldest stone the fortress contained. In the particular quiet quality of a practitioner whose relationship with the building had developed from the specific activated grief of 14 days ago into the particular ongoing partnership of 2 entities that had found each other and were continuing the work together. Aldrin came on the 26th morning. He came without announcement, in the specific quality of someone who had been waiting for the appropriate moment to have a specific conversation, and had decided that this morning's particular quality of the foundation stone's ambient warmth was the appropriate moment. He sat beside her against the foundation stone. He said nothing for a moment. She felt the stone's response to his presence, the particular warmth of an ancient building that recognized the specific person whose family had been its steward for 6 generations and whose current governance was the thing the building was built to serve. She said, "The stone knows you." He said, "Yes." He said, "It is." He paused with the particular quality of someone reaching for accurate language, for an experience that resisted ordinary language. He said, "Warmer." He said, "Toward me than toward the average person walking through the corridors." She said, "Yes." She said, "The building has loyalty the way stone has structure." She said, "It is embedded in the composition." He said, 6 generations of my family has been responsible for this building." She said, yes. He said, and it has been holding their secrets and their evidence and their resources in its architecture for every generation of that 6. She said, yes. He said, and speaking to you. She said, to me specifically. She said, yes. He said, Mira. She said, yes. He said, I have been building something across 26 days. He said it with the particular directness of someone who had made a specific decision and was delivering it without the management that would have made it more comfortable and less accurate. He said, not the governance investigation, not the institute, not the audit, though all of those things are real and significant. He said, the specific quality of 26 days of coming to wherever you are in this building and finding someone who tells me what the building tells her and what the accurate record shows and what the full version of things looks like rather than the managed version. He said, I want to say what that quality produces before we are too far into the building of everything else to say it in the specific way it should be said. She said, say it. He said, the bond is present. He said it with the plain quality of accurate information. He said, it has been present since approximately the 8th day. He said, I am naming it in this specific location rather than a governance space because this is where the building chose to speak, and this is where the building's choice seems most genuinely applicable to the conversation. She said, where the stones could hear. He said, yes. She looked at the foundation stone under both their hands, the specific oldest stone in the fortress's 300-year architecture. Warm with the accumulated witness of the building's full history, and warm now with the particular quality of 2 people being genuinely present in the space it had been communicating toward for a long time. She said, 26 days of evidence. She said, the bond has been present since approximately the 6th day. She said, I have been building the evidence base with the specific patient attention of a practitioner who knows that the most important assessments require the most careful time. He said, and the evidence? She said, it shows someone who came to a hidden room and did not try to manage what it contained. She said, someone who read a 300-year audit report because it needed to be read personally. She said, someone who sat in the North Tower room not because it was useful to governance, but because the building had something there and he wanted to be in the presence of it. She said, and someone who is saying the true thing here at the foundation stone rather than in a governance chamber. He said, yes. She said, the bond. She said, yes. She said, in the full version, the removal and the foundation stone and the 12 days in the hidden architecture and the 26 mornings of building what the building required. He said, yes. The foundation stone was warm. The fortress had been holding things for a very long time, and it was, in the particular patient way of ancient stone, deeply satisfied. 2 years forward, the Living Architecture Institute had 14 practitioners in its active network, distributed across the fortress and its territorial holdings with the specific formal recognition and operational support that the founding framework had established. Not all 14 had the full stone communion at her depth. The gift expressed at different levels in different practitioners, some received structural memory as the ambient quality she had always experienced before the activation. The particular warmth and emotional geography of old buildings that produced in them the specific intuitive architectural knowledge that the gift's passive level generated. 3 had the full communion at varying depths of development. 2 had a variant of the gift that communicated not through structural memory, but through the specific emotional record of spaces, the accumulated feeling, rather than the accumulated knowledge, which produced a different kind of intelligence that was, she had discovered, often the more immediately useful form for the pastoral and community governance functions that the fortress's territorial holdings required. All 14 had been found through the Institute's identification protocol, the specific community-based approach that asked about individuals who seemed to understand old buildings in the particular way that indicated gift capacity, who were drawn to ancient structures, who could often tell you things about a building's history that they had no ordinary means of knowing. Most of them had been attributing the gift to architectural intuition or sensitivity, or simply a love of old places that they had not thought to examine more closely. The concealed architecture audit had been completed in the first year. The formal record now contained the complete architecture of the fortress, all 17 original hidden spaces, the 3 additional spaces discovered in the audit's course, and the specific governance relevance assessment of each. The record was the most comprehensive architectural documentation of a single structure that had been produced in the governance region's history, which meant it had attracted specific attention from architectural institutions in neighboring territories who wanted to understand the audit methodology. The methodology required the communion. The Institute had begun receiving requests. The Western Wing's sealed room had been fully accessed, and its documentation had been the foundation of the ore deposit transaction investigation, which had produced the specific governance accounting that the transaction scale required the particular formal restitution process that placed the transaction's 14-year financial impact in the governance record as a debt to be addressed through the Cavan family trust's current holdings. The fortress now knew where all its loyalties were held. Not through surveillance or monitoring through the particular accumulated institutional memory of a building that had been witnessing governance for 3 centuries, and that had, through the Institute's ongoing communion practice, become an active partner in the governance it had always been surrounding. She was reviewing the Institute's second-year expansion proposals when Aldrin came in. He sat at the working table in the Institute's main chamber, the chamber that had been established in the space adjacent to the original North Tower hidden room, which was now a formal archive room rather than a sealed secret, and which communicated through the thin wall separating the 2 spaces the particular warmth of its proximity. He said, "The Eastern Territory request." She said, "Yes." She said, "The ancient garrison in the Eastern Territory has been communicating with the 2 practitioners we placed there for preliminary assessment." She said, "The garrison is approximately 240 years old and has significant hidden architecture that the territory's current governance has no record of." He said, "The second deployment." She said, "Yes." She said, "I am recommending practitioner Savin for the lead role." She said, "Her ambient stone sensitivity in older structures is the highest of the current network after my own." She said, "She is ready." He said, "Authorize the deployment." She said, "Yes." He said, "The foundation stone." She said, "Yes." He said, "The morning session." She said, "Yes." She said, "The building communicated something new this morning." She said, "The oldest section of the north wall has structural memory of the pre-fortress settlement that occupied this site before the current building's construction." She said, "The communication is faint, approximately 340 years of accumulated memory before the fortress itself began." She said, "It is the particular quality of the site's long history rather than the buildings." He said, "The site has been occupied since before the fortress." She said, "Yes." She said, "The communion reaches further than the building's construction." She said, "The site itself has memory." He looked at her with the particular quality of 2 years of mornings. He said, "How far back?" She said, "I do not know yet." She said, "I am learning the language of site memory, which is different from the structural memory language." She said, "It will take time." He said, "Yes." She thought about the foundation stone and the particular moment she had sat weeping against it 2 years ago, and it had answered. She thought about 12 days in the hidden architecture, the North Tower documents, the armory, the Western Wing room. She thought about 14 practitioners across the network finding the buildings that had been trying to speak to them. She thought about the audit's formal record and what it meant to have the complete architecture of an ancient building in the official governance record for the first time. She thought, "I was declared architecturally useless and the building chose me." She thought, the building was right. She thought about what the site memory would contain, the particular accumulated witness of a place that had been occupied for longer than the building had stood. The specific deep history that the stone communion was beginning to open at the edges of its range. She thought, the stone has been holding things since before the fortress was built. She thought, I have a long time of listening ahead of me. She placed her palm against the Institute's interior wall. The building said, yes. Her story has come to an end, but our journey together continues. If you found this story inspiring and meaningful, please like the video to support me. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next empowering stories. And if you have any thoughts about the characters, her journey, or want to share your own story, please comment below. I really look forward to reading and chatting with you.